Right, it's time to put your iPhones away, and I'd like to welcome Willian Frentzen, who is a federal prosecutor with the Attorney General's Office in the United States of America. William, thank you. Welcome to South Africa. And we're actually really quite cool, very law-abiding citizens, despite what you read.
Thank you.
Welcome, over to you.
Hello. Yeah, end of the day, bring out the feds and the heat. The guy in the boring gray suit, right? Yeah, thank you for having me. Been here for a couple days now on Cape Town first. Just got here last night, but it's been awesome, beautiful place. So far, so good. As this says here, I'm the chief of the Organized Crime Strike Force in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Northern District of California. I'm based in San Francisco. Our district covers San Francisco, Oakland, and then down through Silicon Valley and into San Jose. To the extent that our office covers Silicon Valley, this is clearly Bitcoin, digital currency in general is an issue of great interest where we are. I'm in the Organized Crime Strike Force, and it was a couple years ago, sort of my bread and butter is organized crime in the Bay Area. It tends to be Russian organized crime, Asian organized crime, gangs, outlaw motorcycle, Hells Angels, things like that, and a wide variety of different sorts of criminal activity, including like murders and things like that. So I'm not a expert on or a technical person with respect to Bitcoin or blockchain, but this is an area that a couple years ago, working out of my section, we realized that in one form or another, whichever form of digital currency ends up sort of making it out and lasting, which right now obviously the prevalent one is Bitcoin, that it was going to be something that folks who were interested in conducting criminal activity were going to be trying to utilize, and from that perspective, we should be focused on that, and we should be focused on trying to stay ahead of the curve in terms of what the folks that we're interested in looking at are out there doing. And fairly quickly, we've gotten involved in a couple of cases that I'm going to talk about here today that involve Bitcoin or digital currency. And I'm going to talk about basically two different cases in terms of the sort of the variety or the different perspective and so on. What we basically are focused on, one is criminal offenses involving digital currency, which could be any sort of crime, whether it's narcotics, whether it's murder for hire, whether it's identity theft, and so on, in which the bad guys are utilizing Bitcoin rather than other forms of money because they have a sense of its anonymity, and also because I think in large part they believe it to be, or a lot of them in our experience believe it to be untraceable, which is clearly an accident on their part, a misunderstanding, to say the least. But we also deal with the regulation of exchanges and money transmitters, which I know has already been discussed a fair amount. We also, I would say, with respect to our office, we've created a position within my unit that's called the Digital Currency Crimes Coordinator. So we actually have a specific role for one individual in our office to stay on top of this, and I happen to supervise her. She's fantastic. And we also have formed a digital currency crime task force, a working group, with a lot of different federal and state partners, again, to work with the local agencies, try to stay ahead of what's coming up, and so on. And we've also developed, I think, very good connections with the industry in the sense that we are very aware that there's nothing inherently illegal about Bitcoin or about digital currency, but that it simply can be utilized just as dollars, just as rand, just as any other form of currency can be used to commit crime and so on. As I just said, it's not illegal. What we've seen is a lot of wide variety of crime being involved where they've involved digital currency. We've seen money laundering, narcotics trafficking. There have been terrorism issues, identity theft and access device fraud. There, usually, it's what we've seen is bogus credit cards and paying for people's personal identification to be able to get bogus credit cards, or also to do tax returns. This is currently a huge criminal industry, is people's personal information. You submit for tax returns, you dummy up tax records, and the IRS will automatically transmit the money into an account somewhere, and you pick all that up, you bundle it up, and a lot of people are making a lot of money off of the IRS. And murder for hire, utilizing Bitcoin or other digital currency to offer to pay for it. And again, of course, the issue is trying to detect the criminal uses versus legitimate uses. And then regulation, which is obviously a big issue. It's been discussed a fair amount. You guys understand all of this. And here, a big issue with us is FinCEN registration, and knowing that we're doing our best to try to prevent illegal uses, because there are safeguards in place to be able to try to tell the difference between money laundering the proceeds from human trafficking or from narcotics sales, or money being used to finance terrorism versus all the other legitimate uses. There's a federal statute that governs unlicensed money transmitting businesses that carries a 5-year potential imprisonment and a fine of $250,000 or otherwise under the Treasury laws. These are just definitions under 1960 that we've dealt with, and I'll get into a little bit of a specific example. Although we didn't prosecute, we reached a settlement, but that was at issue. Specific criminal activity, I'll start with Silk Road. We didn't prosecute the Silk Road case out of my office. We dealt with the head of Silk Road, Dread Pirate Roberts, was his Silk Road handle. The real person was Ross Ulbricht. He was arrested in San Francisco, about 2 blocks from my office. We handled shipping him off to the office that had investigated him and ended up trying him, which was in New York. The search had gone on for a couple of years. I'll get into some of the details, and nobody knew exactly where he was at first. He ended up finding him in San Francisco. Silk Road, I think everybody's heard of Silk Road, but just briefly, it was effectively an eBay for narcotics and other illegal goods, like illegal fake identification and other things. They tried to sell guns for a while, but he didn't make much money, so he stopped doing that. Bitcoin was the acceptable currency. You'd create an account on Silk Road, and Bitcoin was what everybody utilized to buy drugs off of Silk Road. It was on the dark web, so you had to access it through Tor, the Onion router, and it was run by Dread Pirate Roberts or Ross Ulbricht. Again, he was caught in San Francisco, a couple blocks away, in a public library. The agents who had eventually identified him set up basically a way of getting him. They didn't want to give him any time to enable any safeguards that he might have in place. And as I understand it, had he just been able to close his MacBook, we would not have gotten a lot of the information that we got. But they set up a distraction, which was a couple getting into an altercation, and when he looked away, they ran over and grabbed his laptop before he could shut it down. And as a result, we got great information off of what was on his laptop, some of which I'll get into that came up in our case. So the Silk Road case stemmed from New York and from Baltimore. There were two separate ongoing investigations into Silk Road. And, you know, I mean, Silk Road, right, it was a drug marketplace. It was open and notoriously criminal. The only issue was who the heck is running this thing. And so they were trying to identify Dread Pirate Roberts and figure out who he was. And two different task forces or groups, if you will, in the United States were investigating at the same time. New York ended up figuring out who he was first and ended up catching him. Baltimore was also investigating him, Baltimore, Maryland, and they eventually brought charges against him. They originally brought charges against a John Doe because they didn't know who he was yet, and then eventually brought charges. Those charges are still pending. This is just Silk Road, an example of you know, the kinds of things that you could go on and purchase with Bitcoin and look around and shop. It's Marco Polo's on here. That was the Baltimore arm of the investigation. And so just to, our entry point on this, other than handling Ross Ulbricht when he was initially arrested and getting him shipped back to New York, was after his arrest, we began to get information that perhaps there was an agent out of the Silk Road investigation in Baltimore who had issues related to Bitcoin activities that caused us to open up our own investigation, and that investigation culminated last year with the conviction of 2 federal agents and those agents being sentenced. And so that's primarily what I'm going to talk about. I mean, if you follow the news, you know that Ross Ulbricht was found guilty by a jury. The federal judge took his activities very serious, and she actually sentenced him to serve a life sentence, in large part, I think, influenced by testimony presented at the sentencing that there were, I think they counted at least 6 individuals who had purchased narcotics off of Silk Road and died as a result. And so that case is sort of wrapped, although it's on appeal, so I'm certainly not making any comments about that case, which is still pending. Our case involving the 2 federal agents is wrapped. They've pled guilty and they've been sentenced. But there was a multi-agency task force, like I say, in Baltimore that had agents from a lot of different agencies. Karl Mark Force IV was a DEA agent, Drug Enforcement Administration agent, and he posed on Silk Road as Knob, which was his, he was posing as an undercover. I have a lot of undercover cases. Usually my undercover cases involve an agent actually infiltrating a motorcycle gang, organized crime organization, physically going and being introduced by somebody and eventually building up enough goodwill to be able to record criminal activity. But here was an undercover that was online. And so he was undercover, but from a laptop. Karl Force posed as Knob, which was essentially his cover was a higher level drug dealer than just sort of selling, single uses, but being of a higher level in terms of his ability to obtain and sell narcotics, and posing as as Hispanic of some variety. And part of his conversations and chats with DPR, which he ended up basically sort of befriending him, was you should take this business to another level. You should be dealing larger quantities than what you're dealing, and let me talk to you about that and school you through it. I mean, DPR was not, so far as certainly I'm aware, any kind of a high-level narcotics dealer until Silk Road, and Silk Road to a certain extent was kind of a, if you will, misguided sort of libertarian ideal of, everybody should be able to buy anything they want, and they should be able to utilize Bitcoin to do it, and they should be able to operate under cover of darkness and so on. But he wasn't like, in the normal chain of narcotics. He was setting up a place for people to buy and sell whatever they wanted to buy and sell, but he wasn't himself in the chain or a supplier, and Knob was posing sort of as that position. And this is a photograph here of Special Agent Carl Force with the DEA. I don't really know why this is funny, but somebody thought this was funny, but it was useful just to, so Carl Force, as I go through this, utilized a variety of different identities, some of which were known and sanctioned to the investigation, like Knob, which was supposed to be, like I said, the undercover persona that he was utilizing to deal with DPR. What Mr. Force ended up doing, however, was to also take on several other identities, one of which was French made, which is, I guess, the uniform there, and the other was Death from Above, and began interacting with DPR in ways to try to personally enrich himself rather than to further the investigations. First, initially, in terms of his criminal activity, Carl Force was interacting with DPR and told DPR that as Knob, as this mid-level or higher-level drug dealer, that he had access to a corrupt government employee, and he referred to him as Kevin. Knob, Carl Force as Knob, indicated to DPR that he could go ahead and get information that the government had about its ongoing investigation in order to try to be able to warn DPR if the government was closing in. This actual interaction was sanctioned in the sense that it was part of the undercover plan, and then they might be able to feed DPR false information, et cetera, and they'd be able to interact with him in a certain way to be able to further the investigation. Unfortunately, what happened was, although the setup was authorized, the follow-through was not. And a lot of what we know and what we understand through the course of our investigation, just so you get where we were getting things, is we had DPR, Ross Ulbricht's laptop, like I said, and one of the files on the laptop was called LE Counter Intel. And in that, he had a large number of chats that he engaged in with different people over Silk Road or in private messaging, where they offered law enforcement sensitive information to him. And so we got chats that were chats with Knob, and we got chats, as I'll show later, with some of the other identities that Mr. Force was using to interact with DPR. But so on this, Force wrote it up that he had sent a PGP encrypted communication to DPR and advised DPR that Kevin wanted a donation of bitcoins from DPR, the inference being that the information on the Silk Road investigation is valuable. So this is something that he wrote up officially to the file, and so it's what was, if you will, sort of the evidence in the case, in the original case, the Silk Road investigation. And Force also made an entry in his official memorandum saying, sort of agent's note, DPR never paid for the information. And again, with the exception of one message here that DPR authored, everything was encrypted. And we were unable to get, we did not have Force's private keys to be able to get into the encrypted messaging, which is obviously should be a red flag that an undercover agent would be interacting with somebody in an encrypted fashion and not memorializing the private key so that you could actually get, I mean, in other words, there's no reason for the feds to take somebody into encrypted conversations unless maybe you were trying to build up your bona fides to say, hey, you know, I'm going to do this in an encrypted fashion because I know what I'm doing and I know how important secrecy is. But if you were going to do that, you would certainly, in some place or in some fashion, retain the encrypted information. And Mr. Force did not do that. But The unencrypted communication in the thread we got was from DPR to Knob, saying, I could not decrypt your second message, got an error, I could decrypt the first, and have sent the 525 Bitcoin as requested. Please keep me posted, you have my word, no one else knows anything about this. I'm sorry I didn't know how much to send before. I was afraid of offending if I sent too little and looking foolish if I sent too much. I hope I didn't make things too difficult for you. You can see they had a very sort of kind of cordial and bizarre relationship here. But anyway, within 2 hours, DPR sending that, Force responded with an encrypted message, but the subject line, which we could read, said, use PGP, an exclamation point. And again, this is somebody who said in the agent's note he never got paid, but clearly here DPR is saying, I paid you the 525 for the information, the law enforcement information from Kevin, thank you, hope it's, you know, not too much or too little. And then, sorry, this is a little over the, but we then saw where we were able to eventually track the 525 Bitcoin coming from DPR eventually into Carl Force's accounts. How did we track the payments? This was a big issue in the case for us because we had a lot of smoke, obviously, in investigating this thing, but we also had to tie it, in other words, we had to link it all the way back. You know, it looked dirty, but to be able to really make the case come together, we had to track money, and we had Bitcoin that we had found eventually going into a variety of different accounts held by Carl Force. He created a company, a shell company that he said was investing in Bitcoin strictly. He claimed that he had purchased Bitcoin at the very, very beginning, I think for, he said, $4 a coin, from little mom and pops, and that it was, you know, there would be no record of it and so on, and that he just had gotten lucky, and as it had appreciated and so on, he'd been buying and selling and buying and selling and making the money that he made. And we wanted to be able to prove, no, this money was in fact coming from the target. This is, sorry, this is, I think, the 525 Bitcoin. So what we had to do to be able to put the whole thing together, obviously, was we had money coming into Carl Force's accounts. We knew that DPR had referred to paying 525 Bitcoin. We also were fortunate that we had, that New York had imaged the Silk Road server at a certain point, which gave us then a starting point, an exit point, an analysis of the blockchain. Then, and for law enforcement, I think it's worth saying that from our perspective, the beauty of the blockchain is the traceability of Bitcoin. And clearly a lot of the crooks don't get this. They understand the anonymity, but they don't understand is how traceable it is. And that once you go to liquidate it, unless you liquidate it in a way that we can't figure out, or unless we can't, for some reason, track it back to the starting point, or if they're engaged in mixing and tumbling, that we're, you know, and unlike a bank, I mean, take a bank, somebody commits a crime and tries to hide the money in US dollars or rand, I mean, I've got to at least go and get a subpoena, or I've got to get something, and I'm sure, you know, whatever the nature of process is for law enforcement here or elsewhere in Africa, you're likely to have to show something to somebody to be able to get them to give you the records. Whereas the blockchain, you don't need it. I mean, the blockchain is there, right? So this is the Silk Road account that DPR held on Silk Road. I'm sorry, the Bitcoin account. He held certain accounts on the site, and the eventual payoff there, that is Carl Force in the bottom left, and we were able to track it out. After successfully getting this 525 Bitcoin through these shenanigans, Special Agent Force also engaged, as I said, as French maid. Like I said, when he was arrested, when DPR was arrested in San Francisco, he had his laptop open, and there was this LE counterintel, law enforcement counterintelligence, that had these various chats. Reading through the chats, we saw an individual called French maid, and Ulbricht had notes that he had paid about $100,000 to French maid. This is all sort of basically in the course of 2013, by the way, and Ross Ulbricht was eventually caught in October of 2013. But so while this activity is going on, it's in a buildup during 2013. So we knew in looking at the chats that somebody named French maid had talked to him about selling him law enforcement information, and we knew that he had indicated that he'd paid a lot of money. So taking a look at the messages, most of them, again, were encrypted, which we don't have access to. However, we had some unencrypted conversations, and French maid wrote to DPR, and this, one would say, is a pretty colossal screw-up if your first name is Carl Force, Special Agent Carl Force of the DEA. I have received important information that you need to know ASAP. Please provide me with your public key for PGP. Carl. About 4 hours later, our genius sent a follow-up message saying, whoops, and then saying, I am sorry about that. My name is Carla Sophia. I have many boyfriends and girlfriends in the marketplace. DPR will want to hear what I have to say. Smiley, XOX. So, and among the issues here in taking a look at it, not only did we have the Carl, but there are a lot of Carls. But we also had indications that both Carl Force as Knob and this French maid were utilizing a relatively outdated version of PGP, and also had not gone through to do things like erase the tag, which, as I understand it, if there's a tag, that's probably kind of a rookie move, because the tag could possibly be an indication just in terms of what, what system you're utilizing. And so that was something that we were able to match up exactly which encryption Force as Knob and French maid were utilizing, which is another good indication that French maid was Carl Force. And so 770 Bitcoin we were able to, again, trace going to Carl Force, and at that time that would have been about $97,000, so close to 100 grand. Again, in most of this movement, it would appear, I mean, there was a payment out into wallets, and then it would appear that it was Force who was the one who was moving them wallet to wallet and sort of breaking, as I showed on the last slide, I think, where he was moving a lot of the money around. And so as a result, at the eventual guilty plea, he pled to money laundering on top of everything else. Another issue occurred with an individual who was an administrator on Silk Road called Flush. I'll try to run through this, but long story short, Flush got busted for accepting a kilogram of cocaine as an intermediary. He was an administrator on Silk Road. He worked for DPR in trying to handle vendors' accounts and buyers' accounts and so on, and deal with complaints on Silk Road. And he also was sort of involved in small sales of a lot of pharmaceutical painkillers. But a controlled delivery was set up where Flush agreed to take a kilo of cocaine in order to send it on to another individual. And this was part of Baltimore's investigation to try to get closer to DPR, and as they went through, they would bust a lot of the vendors for just the straight up drug dealing and see if they could flip them to find out and get closer. What happened here is and this is something that, let me just backtrack a little bit. There was also death from above. Carl Force also tried to basically extort about $250,000 from DPR by posing as death from above. And there, rather than sort of being friendly and offering law enforcement information, sort of threatened DPR and said, I know who the heck you are, and I'm coming after you if you don't pay me 250 grand. DPR was not particularly impressed by these threats, and I think also when that persona that Force was using, death from above, started leaking some of the information about who he thought DPR was, he got it wrong, and so that wasn't very convincing, I think, that he actually needed to pay him, so that he never, as far as we can tell, he never paid on that. So Silk Road was raided on January, I believe, 25th of 2013, into the early morning hours of January 26, 2013, and approximately 20,000 plus Bitcoin were stolen out of Silk Road during the course of that night. And people on Silk Road went nuts, and DPR went nuts, and so on. So, and this is sort of a long, convoluted story. I'll try to cut it short, but during the course of our investigation, we always knew that this money had been, that all of this Bitcoin had been stolen out of Silk Road itself. And we were, of course, suspicious of Carl Force, because the money that was stolen out of Silk Road was stolen on the very night that federal agents met with Flush, this individual Flush. They'd busted him on a controlled buy, and they'd said, okay, now you need to, you know, help us out and work with us and so on. And so they were talking to Flush about how do you administer Silk Road? What kind of access do you have? They got very excited because they now had an entry point into an individual who could go on and manipulate the site and was trusted, right? Certainly more trusted than other individuals might be. And this is a good entry point to be able to try to set something up to try to figure out who DPR is. So as they're going through getting the information from Flush, Flush teaches them a lot of things, including how to reset passwords and thereby shut somebody out of their account. And they also know that there's a lot of accounts on Silk Road where people are holding Bitcoin. So there's a lot of Bitcoin just available on the site. Late that night into the next morning, a rash of vendors on Silk Road get locked out of their accounts. Their passwords are changed, they're reset. And then people go into those vendors' accounts and begin raiding Bitcoin out of there and moving it through what I'll call a pass-through account. Through this pass-through account and out and gone. People freak out. One of the other administrators on Silk Road, it happens to be up in the middle of the night that night and eventually sees what's going on, eventually sort of figures out, can't get in touch with DPR. I think it happened to be like the one time that for like years that Ross Ulbricht wasn't on the site, because I think he finally caved to his girlfriend or something and went camping. But anyway, and of course this happens. But so the other administrator shuts down the access to the site that the other administrator, that Flush, has. But in the meantime, 20,000 plus Bitcoin are gone. DPR goes berserk. He and the other administrator, of course, suspect Flush, not understanding that it wasn't just Flush by that point in the evening that had access to this. So we thought, you know, it's either Flush and he just double-crossed the government, which is what, of course, the people that were in the room interviewing him, with the exception of a couple people, thought was actually going on. But DPR went nuts. So one of the individuals who was there that day was an individual by the name of Sean Bridges. He was a U.S. Secret Service agent, and he was part of the Baltimore Silk Road Task Force, part of the investigation. And as we continued to investigate this, we knew that access to that pass-through account, in other words, the Bitcoin had been going through this one account and then moving out into a variety of different wallets, and we knew that had to be significant, and we thought force must control that account. Eventually we got the agent's emails, and as we read and read, it turned out that that pass-through account was in fact handled. We saw an email where Force emails Bridges and says, hey, can you top off one of my undercover accounts out of this account that happens to also be the pass-through account? And I got to tell you, like, the hair stood up on the back of my neck as we all realized there's not just one of them, there's two of them active doing this kind of thing while they're supposed to be investigating. And so it turns out Sean Bridges was the individual who was controlling that pass-through account and was the individual who was stealing the 20,000 Bitcoin during the course of the night. And I'll get into where the money moved in a second. The extremely unfortunate fallout from this is DPR became so enraged that he decided that he needed to have Flush murdered. The person that he went to the very next day, as they are still continuing to meet with Flush, the person that he goes to whack Flush is his good friend Knob, who's Carl Force. And Carl Force agrees that he will in fact kill Flush for him if the price is right. Now this part he does above board. This is too big to hide, right? Well, I don't want to say, I don't know if he ever intended to hide that or not, but this is too big. And you've got a bunch of federal agents who are all going berserk at Flush because they don't suspect one of their own, and they legitimately believe that Flush has in fact double-crossed them, and he spent the entire night raiding 20,000 Bitcoin out of Silk Road. And you know, so they're upset with him. So they agree to a price, and Knob, Carl Force, goes ahead, and what they do is they pretend to kill Flush. So they take Flush into a room and they pretend to drown him in a bathtub. They photograph it. They send photographs to Sean Bridges as sort of one of their technical experts, and Sean Bridges wipes, you know, all the data off of the photographs so that it can't be determined when the photograph was taken, et cetera, et cetera. So he assists in basically dummying up the murder of the guy now that he knows is being blamed for stealing all of the 20,000 Bitcoin that he stole, right? Like if you made this into a movie, nobody would believe it. And so anyway, and then Sean Bridges goes about moving eventually the Bitcoin into Mt. Gox. This is significant because in May of 2013, Sean Bridges, he sets up a company, Quantum LLC, which is supposed to be involved in, you know, Bitcoin trading. There's a lot of back and forth between Force and Bridges, who, by the way, we do not know if they ever colluded or if they were just, you know, this is, anyway, one of the left unknown questions about the case, but about all the current value of Bitcoin. At that time, it was fluctuating up to, I think, like 60, 70 bucks and so on. And at that time, they were getting very excited because, you know, at that point in time, this was, you know, to them a lot of money. Of course, if he'd held on to the 20 grand and liquidated later, it would have been worth, you know, however many millions when it really shot up. But in any event, so he moves it into Mt. Gox. He then gradually liquidates it and moves it out of Mt. Gox into an account that he holds at Fidelity under Quantum LLC. The final movement of the final liquidation and movement out of Mt. Gox occurs on May 7th, 2013. On May 9th, 2013, Sean Bridges is the affiant, meaning he's the author and the agent swearing out a warrant to seize millions of dollars out of Mt. Gox on the basis that Mt. Gox is, you know, in violation of the law, and they are holding proceeds of money laundering and et cetera. So 2 days before he authors that seizure warrant, he sort of skedaddles out of there. And we had to trace this back. We needed a lot. We needed the servers. We needed the assistance. We had Mt. Gox was by this point in bankruptcy proceedings. and so we needed assistance there. But we got a lot of assistance on this, and we were finally able to put together and track all of the money to Sean Bridges. I don't have a lot of time left. Ripple Labs is not a criminal case. Ripple Labs was an investigation that we conducted into that digital currency as not being registered with FinCEN, but being a money service business. I know I sent to the nice folks putting on the event the actual settlement agreement, if you actually want to take a look at it. But the issues were Ripple Labs with their digital currency, it's XRP, was not registered with FinCEN and was not in compliance in our judgment. We entered into negotiations with Ripple Labs, and we wound up basically reaching a settlement by which they agreed to register with FinCEN. They agreed to develop appropriate AML programs, KYC programs, and that they would issue SARs when appropriate. And they paid the Department of Justice, I think, $450,000. They also paid a fine to FinCEN for operating unregistered. Oh, sorry. And I think it was the first sort of civil enforcement action against a digital currency exchange, and sort of basically our way of saying, we appreciate innovation, especially in my district. We appreciate what the industry is trying to do. We recognize that there's no part of it that's inherently criminal, but we also recognize that we have to be able to have a way to keep our eye on the bad actors. And I can only talk about cases that are in the past. I can't really talk about what we're investigating or what we're currently litigating. But suffices to say, there are folks who are profiting greatly, immensely, off of not complying with anything, because, and in fact will openly advertise that, because guess who the crooks want to use? They don't want to use somebody who's going to issue a SAR or ask them who the heck they are, or anything else. What they're going to try to do is go to the entities, the exchanges, that are going to turn a blind eye to pretty much anything. And that's where we obviously feel like we have to draw the line and take a look. And so just to close out, as I said, we know it's here to stay in some form, whatever it is. Silk Road 2.0 sprang up within, I think, moments of Silk Road going down, and then was subsequently also busted. I don't know what iteration they're on now. I stopped paying attention. I know there's another entity out there. I just can't. The name doesn't come to mind right now. That's the big. It's no longer Silk Road, but I forget the name right now. I can get it for you if you want to go shopping. But like anything, the crooks will figure it out and they'll get better at it. We've got mixing, we've got tumbling, things that make it more difficult for us to trace, and we'll just try to continue to keep up, get ahead of trends. I know there's a lot of questions about regulation, and just remember, I'm not a legislator, I'm not a regulator. By the time I show up, probably something bad has happened, and there should be a law that I can employ to enforce what's happened. Otherwise, I'm not getting involved. So, I'm sort of our job is to lock people up, generally speaking. But the blockchain, as I've said, incredibly useful when compared to other measures that we have to try to trace things and find out what had happened. And that's it.
William, thank you very much. I was wondering if you could sign my no objection letter. Questions?
What's a mixer and tumbler?
There's probably a lot of people in this room who can explain it better than me, but the idea is, in the course of, I would characterize it as generally speaking, money laundering. But a lot of people, I think, may offer more legitimate uses or purposes for it. Certainly, privacy, I think, would be one of those. But the idea is that either by moving the Bitcoin around in certain ways, you can drop the trace, or mixing. So you're taking in a large number of Bitcoin, then you're, and technically, I don't understand, and hopefully, again, somebody else could describe it, but the idea is you're taking in a larger number of Bitcoin than what is coming in, and so you're breaking the one-to-one chain of the Bitcoin coming in, because who's to say that everything that got mixed together in that larger batch necessarily came from this one source or was criminal at all? And so then does it break the chain to be able to say, yes, those Bitcoin are proceeds from unlawful activity, because here it came into a larger batch and then went back out? And I guess the question could be, is there a legitimate purpose for that, et cetera, et cetera? And I'm sure that somebody out there's got a legitimate explanation. And I think it's probably like, I mean, you look at Tor, where people share IP addresses, and people say, well, is there a legitimate purpose for that? And people say, yeah, I don't want anyone to know who I am or where I'm looking from, and so yeah, there's a legitimate purpose. So, but from our perspective, it can be a challenge, and there are services out there that will engage in that.
Hi, William. Thanks for an amazing talk. That was really riveting. So my question has got nothing to do with Bitcoin or anything. I'd like to know if Hollywood has approached you to make the movie. Genuinely want to know. It's fascinating. It should be a movie.
Nobody's approached me. I'd get fired. But I will tell you that one of the things that Carl Force did before we caught him was to sell his life story to 20th Century Fox, who purchased it, and they certainly did not get the same story that they thought they were buying when they thought he was the undercover hero of the Silk Road investigation. What they're going to do with it, if anything now, I do not know, because what he clearly said his life story was is not really anyone's story. I'll let you call it.
Over there, right? We'll follow with you. Microphone's behind you.
I just wanted to find out what sentences are these bad guys serving currently?
So yeah, they were both sentenced, and Carl Force got 6.5 years, and Sean Bridges got 6 years, right around 6 years.
Hi. Just in terms of the defense, I read that they were arguing that it wasn't, DPR was not a single entity. How strong was that, and in terms of your point of view, how did you guys fight that side of it?
Are you talking about the actual Silk Road trial? Yeah. And yeah, that's ongoing litigation. I believe it's on appeal, and I wasn't a part of the. I mean, obviously, we were communicating, and we were working off of some of the same evidence. Let me put it this way: I don't know. I mean, in other words, he may have argued that there was more than one individual who was DPR. That may or may not have gotten any traction, but clearly from the jury's verdict, they believed he was one of the DPRs.
There's an article 2 days back, and it's saying Sean Bridges likely had co-conspirators that are also going to be indicted. Do you know anything about that?
I'm not going to comment on any ongoing, cases. Sorry, I can only comment on the cases that were resolved through a guilty plea and a sentence at this point.
My question is, how difficult was it to educate the jury and the judge on all this technology and trying to understand how you guys unraveled all of this?
So they both pled guilty, so we didn't end up with a jury. I will tell you that we had a lot of questions in the build-up when we thought that they might want to go to trial about educating the jury. We certainly had to educate the judges. There were judges who issued the warrants in the first instance. which was a magistrate judge, and then there was a district court judge who we had to educate for the sentencing purposes and to understand all of the different ins and outs. And it took some time, I think. I think it's like any other area that you get, and I'm by no means, you know, probably everyone in this room knows more about Bitcoin than I do. So, you know, I had to get up to speed to be able to investigate the case and prosecute the case. But I think it's like anything else, that there's a certain amount of jargon, and once you get past the jargon, it's sort of understandable as other things are, like currency, you know. Although it obviously has some very different, it moves and works in some different ways. But I don't think it was too difficult, and our judge certainly got it. We did have a lot of concerns about, just sort of from an evidentiary perspective, in terms of the rule. I know this is not a legal crowd, so I won't bore you with it, but we had a lot of concerns about how are we going to be able to get things into evidence, as much as will the jury understand this, you know.
Great. William, thank you very much. Thank you for taking the trip all the way out to South Africa for us. We really appreciate it.